Welcome to the 39th event in our Virtually Speaking series. We launched these events during the first lockdown, and we're really grateful to all our fantastic speakers who've taken part since then, and to you, the audience, for joining us. The talks have been on a very wide range of topics, and if you'd like to catch up on any you've missed, you can do so on our video library, which you'll find on the Latimer Foundation website. Or I think Joe is putting the link in the chat right now. All the talks are free, but we've invited people to make a small donation in support of our bursary program when booking their ticket. And I'm really delighted to say that so far some £21,000 has been raised from the Virtually Speaking series since last summer. This money will be put to work right away, providing a bursary for a child joining Latimer this September. If any of you would like to make a donation but haven't had time to do so yet, then please see the link, which is also in the chat. Without any more delay, I'd like to introduce our two very eminent speakers tonight, Andrew Knight and Zanny Minton Beddoes. Andrew's long and very distinguished career in journalism includes being former editor of The Economist, editor-in-chief of the Daily Telegraph, executive chairman of News International, now News UK, and director of News Corporation. He is currently the chairman of Times Newspapers. It's really wonderful to have you with us tonight, Andrew. Zanny has spent 25 years at The Economist and became its first female editor-in-chief in 2015. She is a renowned global economics expert, and before joining The Economist, worked at the IMF and as an advisor to the Minister of Finance in Poland. I know how busy both of you are, so we are so grateful for giving your time to us this evening. Now, I know that many of you have sent in questions in advance, and Andrew and Zanny will endeavor to answer most of them over the next hour. If you'd like to post a question in the chat, we'll try to come to them if time permits at the end. So, Andrew and Zanny, over to you.
You've said something which actually makes me rather jealous, which is that that Zanny has been 25 years on The Economist. I was there only 20 years, and it's the nicest family outside our own families that one could possibly ever work with and at. We are actually in a revolutionary time, and we know it. We all know it. Doesn't need saying. But I'm going to try and give a little bit of historic context, I think. There have been other revolutionary times. I mean, China, I think I'm right in saying, brought in printing in the 600s or so. And then we had Gutenberg and Caxton bringing it to Europe in the 1400s. I can't remember when. And these did extraordinary things. They blew up the worlds of the time, just as the web is now blowing up our world. And by and large, in a very, very positive way. In other words, elites and obscurantism were by and large got rid of by what happened. And religion, which was a monopoly at the time in Europe, a Catholic monopoly, suddenly it became something much less of a monopoly, thanks to Luther's hammering something on a door and it going viral, so to speak, in the establishment of the time. The question, I suppose, is when these revolutionary things happen, how does society deal with it? Because it does, its disruption is never easy to handle. We know it's healthy. I mean, if you just look at I only ever once wrote a speech which Mr. Rupert Murdoch delivered, which this was after the Sky got established and you got multiple channels. And he gave this speech using my words, which said that this was going to totally disrupt totalitarian regimes all around the world. At which point the Chinese banned him. And he's never properly got back into China. It cost him billions, that speech, but it was the right thing to say, because disruption and going across borders with media does actually undermine bad things. it also gives rise to some bad things as well, which we find difficult as a society to cope with. We all know the problem in politics and social affairs now of echo chambers, and we have a sort of misinformation paradigm now, which is extremely difficult for people, individuals, to deal with when they find themselves the targets of abuse, which politicians find very difficult to deal with, society finds very difficult to deal with. You get extraordinary things that simply don't make any sense, that going viral, that 5G masks are going to spread coronavirus, or that Bill Gates is planning a genocidal plot, or, for example, that the Sarah Everard vigil was just manipulated by the government to help its policing bill through. You get these things which do go viral and do cause harm, and yet they somehow have to be lived with, because we live in an open society, and I feel we should be able to cope with them in an open society. The difficulty is that things become abusive and unrepresentative of what ordinary people would like to be. So that is one difficulty of what's happening, it seems to me, in the media. Remember, it wasn't just printing. We had the telephone starting in the 19th century. We had radio. We had television. Television was forecast to destroy radio. It didn't. There was proliferation, if anything. So these things, all the terrors that happen at times like this, tend to be dispelled because there is competition, which is very, very good. Does it get rid of things that we desire to keep? For example, Zanny and I would very much like to keep newspapers and to keep a journal like the Economist, which I don't think is at any risk whatever in a situation like this, for a reason I'll come to in a second. The other thing that I do worry about, which I'm not sure Zanny will agree with, is that it has created the success of the new media, of the web, has created giants of unbelievable behemoth size. I mean, if you take the BBC, for example, the BBC's revenue, I think, is about £5 billion revenue. If you take News Corp, which is seen as a sort of terrible giant causing mayhem and suppression, often, I regard that as a ludicrous characterization, but I wouldn't I? Its revenue is 10 billion. Now, if you take Google, I'd like to ask the audience, but I won't because it'll waste time, but to guess how big their revenue is. It is 20 times bigger than News Corp. It is 200 billion. And the same goes for Amazon, which is now getting into media. It owns the Washington Post, it has ambitions, and of course, this comes to media as well. It is buying media rights in sport with pocket money. People like Sky and even the BBC and the ITV can't even compete with what Amazon would be able to offer for the rights to the rugby or the cricket or whatever. Amazon wouldn't even notice what they're going to spend on it. So there are distortions. And I then go back, I have to say, and this is just showing my age maybe, but this is before my time, to Teddy Roosevelt in the beginning of the 20th century, when he became president, when President McKinley was assassinated. Roosevelt gave one of his first speeches as an absolute model to me of what you do about gigantism. They had gigantism then in the railways, in the banks, and of course in oil. And he dismantled it all. He created competition, not always great competition. And I have a feeling as a forecast that we will come to that. we will come to some kind, not of regulation, but of dispersal, because otherwise I don't think traditional media, if it has a role, will survive. My other forecast is that there will be because there is so much distortion which is being parlayed out virally, I think there will be the beginning, particularly as educational standards rise all over the world and have risen quite a long way in the first world, there will be a hunt for reliability and integrity. Whether that's a real countervailing force, I don't know. It certainly is, if you look at The Economist. I mean, that is what it's about. I would say the same of the Times. Of course, there are mistakes, but they would be miniature compared with the mistakes that come out on the new media. And so that sense of reliability, I think more and more people are going to hunt for it, not just in politics, but around the world. That's my little sort of historical introduction. Zanny will now take it apart.
I won't. Hello, everybody. It is very nice to be here as an ex-Latimer parent. I'm delighted to be here. Thank you for having me, and it's wonderful to share the stage with my esteemed predecessor, But Five, and also to see in the audience another esteemed predecessor of mine, Bill Emmett. So it's slightly disconcerting to have two of my predecessors here, but it is very nice to be here. I'm not going to disagree with you, Andrew. I'm not stupid enough to do that. But let me give you my my sense of what we're in, and this is a sort of platitudinous almost. But what's happening to media is frankly no different to what's happening to a gazillion other industries, which is that we're in the middle of a huge revolution. The digital revolution which we are only part of the way through, is as big, in many ways bigger than the Industrial Revolution. It's changing every aspect of our life, and we've really noticed it in the last year, where we've accelerated what was expected to take years into months. The fact that we're having this conversation by Zoom, that we've all changed the way we live, the way we work, the way we shop, unbelievable transformation we're in the midst of. And the media industry is being disrupted by it, and journalism is being disrupted by it in no more dramatic ways than many other industries. But it's a huge transformation. And I think overall, in many ways, it's a tremendously exciting transformation. And I guess I'll look at it in two ways, journalistically and commercially, and then perhaps give you a sense of pitfalls. But journalistically, yes, the world that I started in, and certainly the world that Andrew started in and Bill Emmett started in, is a world that is changing fast. People talk about the decline of newspapers. What we're seeing, thanks to digital media, is just a transformation in the way that people consume media, a blurring of boundaries, a tremendous proliferation of sort of exciting new innovations. So it used to be that you had in the sort of latter part of the 20th century, you'd had broadcast media, you had radio, you had television, and you had print newspapers. Now it's all just mixed up, and there's everybody that you can use digital media as a sort of delivery truck and a foghorn, if you will. And so all the, for example, we have far more listeners to our podcast than we have people who read any word of The Economist. We now produce podcasts. We have 2 million YouTube followers who watch our films, and we have small bit part players in a transformation that is happening very dramatically across the board. So the sort of walls between different types of journalism are collapsing. There's all manner of new things that you can do that you couldn't do before. So yes, print is declining, but that doesn't mean the decline of newspapers. It doesn't mean the decline of media necessarily. It means that it's being delivered in a different way. And if I look at, my kids, and I'm sure many Latimer kids wouldn't be seen dead reading a newspaper, but certainly consume news, certainly know what's going on, whether it's through Instagram, whether it's through Snapchat, whether it's listening to a podcast. It's just in different formats. And so a lot of what the media industry or what journalism is about is working out how to use these new delivery formats. I mean, many of you, I'm sure, will have heard of Clubhouse, the latest new hot thing. Should an organization like The Economist be on Clubhouse? That's something I'm thinking about right now. These are the kinds of exciting questions that we think about thanks to this transformation. Commercially, it is challenging because the old business model the 20th century business model of many newspapers, which was to be essentially advertising based, has had to change because advertising, and I'm sort of exaggerating only slightly, has shifted wholesale to digital media and largely to Facebook and Google, who have a huge proportion of overall advertising revenue. So from that, there are various consequences. It's very, very tough for the traditional beneficiaries, and this is particularly true in the US, which had an extremely sort of local monopoly-driven, advertising-driven industry, where the local newspaper in US cities, raked it in. That's been disrupted. Broadly, I think that's actually probably not a bad thing. I believe in disruption. And so yes, newspapers have had to find new business models. A surprising number, thankfully The Economist included, are so functioning perfectly effectively on a subscriber-led business model, and people are prepared to pay for our journalism. That actually seems to be the case for quite a lot of journalism. There's another model that is the rich digital philanthropist buys model. That has a sort of perfectly well-known history in journalism. People have been there before. The 19th century wasn't all that different to that. And so there are areas where I think there is a problem. So local journalism, how is that going to get funded if the advertising model doesn't work? So there are definite areas where we need to think from a societal perspective about what happens. But broadly, I think we should welcome that digital disruption. I think there are some areas though that we should worry about. And there's a lot of talk about, fake news and the spread of fake news. I would distinguish between two things. Firstly, I think we have a slightly sort of rose-tinted view of the past. We've always had fake news. Fake news has been there throughout history. And the 20th century model of national broadcasters and national press was not one devoid of fake news. Yellow journalism in the early 20th century, where all kinds of rubbish was printed by proprietary newspapers in the US, was still there. You had massive propaganda pushed by governments throughout the 20th century. So we've had fake news before. The difference now, I think, the really interesting difference of the digital age is that the business models of the digital behemoths, which is the addictive, feed you what you want to read and feed you more of it, I think encourages a kind of polarization and vociferous nature of the sort of the consumption of news. And so it is quite possible increasingly that not only do Andrew and I consume different kinds of news, we actually have different kinds of fact bases, because we're just, the nature of the current digital media model is that it reinforces biases that we want to read. So the sort of, I will have a very different Facebook experience than he will. And that I think is worrying, because we do now risk being in an environment, and you see it particularly in the United States, but you're seeing elements of it here too, where you have no longer a common agreement about what is true and what is not true, and what is the sort of basic fact base on which we can then have different opinions. And that I think will become, and I'll end with this, will become even more problematic, because the next stage of digital innovation is the sort of successful deep fakes, the ability to create videos, to create sound, which seem genuine, but which are completely fake. And we're on the cusp of that being absolutely perfected. So we will soon be in a world where you will be able to watch a video of me talking and you will have no idea whether it's actually me or not, whether I said that. Or, Joe Biden giving a speech, which may be completely fake, but you won't actually be able to tell whether it's fake or not. And that I think is that element really worries me, because then you have no ability to agree on a common fact base between people. And so that's one where I'd be sort of interested in Andrew's thoughts on how you deal with that. But for me, quite a lot of the sort of concern about the state of media at the moment is slightly overblown. I'm much less worried than a lot of the hand wringing, but I really do worry about that element. Back to you.
That was terrific.
You
So,
got
are the two of us now? Yes, there's a sort of wonderful distinction ever since Trump
you have
started
to answer this question, Andrew. This is a perfect one for you. From Peter Abston to everyone: should the Murdoch empire be dismantled? That's an extremely good question to ask Andrew Knight.
We'll come to that in a minute. it's already so tiny compared with any other that dismantling it wouldn't have much of an effect, I'm afraid. As I said, I mean, it is a fraction of the size of any of the media behemoths, as indeed is the BBC. They are so small. Obviously, they have influence, and by and large, I think both of them have a beneficial influence. The fake news thing is funny because I was thinking as you were talking about fake news that Trump started fake news, started the whole thing. That's fake news. Of course, there's a difference between fake news and genuinely fake news. Because some fake news is quite genuinely fake, like, for example, a lot of this conspiracy theory. Some of it actually, a lot of the stuff that Trump was talking about wasn't fake at all. He just called it fake because he didn't like it.
Yeah, but I mean, he has, you know, accelerated my concerns on this quite a lot. When you have the president of the United States calling perfectly sensible news fake news, then he encouraged the decline of trust in mainstream media in the US accelerated very dramatically in the last
Correct.
4 years. And the partisan division, and we don't have that yet here, but I think there are some worrying signs that the UK may be going in this direction. And I'm not sure that all of this opinion TV, and we can come to that, is going to necessarily help this. But in the United States, you have a very, very big gap between Democrats who broadly still trust what's called the mainstream media, and Republicans who just don't trust the vast majority of the media.
Exactly.
And that is a very big sort of societal problem when you have large chunks of people who not only don't trust it, but then do trust these bizarre sort of conspiracy theory networks, you know, OANN, which is the one of the right-wing networks, and you're rapidly in QAnon territory. And you know, QAnon is a very interesting social phenomenon. This completely mad conspiracy theory that, you know, the world is run by satanic pedophiles whom Donald Trump will save the world from. I mean, it's a very, very odd conspiracy theory, but millions of people believe it. We've had conspiracy theories in the past. History's full of them, full of people, you know, these madnesses that grab societies and people believe them. But this one, it's quite hard to see how this burns itself out. I mean, it's a really deep-seated thing that has grown up in the last 2-3 years. And so that, I think, could not have happened as fast as it did without the way that social media now works.
Then how does one root out, or not, one can't in a democracy root out, but how does one cope with this aspect of disruption, which has some things about it which are actively wicked, actually, in some ways, because they do have terrible effects. How does one cope with that when we know that the absolute impact of high technological change has been totally and utterly beneficial in many countries, not just in the first world, but in dictatorships as well? As one sees, even in China and certainly in Russia now, for example, you see the beginnings of people actually relying on a lot of stuff that comes through, which they're not meant to get, but which they can't stop getting because it crosses borders.
So I think it's a function of time and innovation. I'm hoping that there will be innovations that will allow us to be able to tell the difference between deep fakes and other fakes and non-deep fakes. But I think the rest of it is time. I have great faith in, you know, generations that grew up digitally native, kind of understanding what is quality and understanding what is good journalism. And it's, you know, it reminds me a bit of the sort of, you know, kind of popular concerns that came when, as you mentioned earlier, you know, around television. People thought television would dull everybody and we'd all become dimwits because we were watching too much TV. It was nonsense. And I think, you know, then there was the same thing about video games. Oh my God, you know, everybody who plays too many video games, they'll lose it's also nonsense. And I think there's interesting surveys actually which show that younger people are much more skeptical and much more savvy to what is fake news, and much more pay much more attention to what is the trusted site and what is a sort of trusted news source. And you know, my hope, and obviously it's a very self-serving one at The Economist, but my hope is that, you know, those organizations that maintain a reputation for rigor and authority and fair-mindedness and being fact-based will be recognized as such, and so that people will know going forward what is trusted journalism and what isn't. And I think we probably have to trust, our kids' generations to be able to do that. And if we can help at all, it's with, and I'm sure this is already happening at Latimer, but it's kind of teaching media literacy. It's teaching, how to distinguish between these things, and it's teaching people to be, sophisticated consumers of digital media rather than just, believers of everything that comes on your phone screen.
Yeah. It's difficult to argue with you because I'm agreeing with everything you say.
Well, there's a very good question here, which is, as great media brands become increasingly digitized, will readers be prepared to pay proper money for strong independent content? I would hope yes, but what do you think?
Well, it raises a very interesting thing, which you and I discussed yesterday, I think, briefly, which is that, of course, the traditional media, and The Economist is absolutely at the core of this, but also the Times, the Guardian, the Telegraph, if you take them in this country, even some of the tabloids, all the tabloids actually spend an extraordinary amount of money on journalists. All the newspapers have been having to cut back, but basically they've kept their core quality. And you could argue that some of the newspapers have kept more than others, but they've all had to cut and cut and cut because of the pressures from the advertising famine that you talked about earlier. And the result is that they're down to a core. That core is expensive, and if you have proper correspondence, as the BBC does, and you have stringers and correspondents around the world, the same with the Times. If one listens to Times Radio now, it's amazing to listen to a correspondent from Tokyo or Russia or from particularly Washington during the last 8-10 months, which have been so fascinating. Those are very expensive people in very expensive places. Now, what Google was doing particularly, and Facebook, was effectively pirating that stuff, just using it for free. And then we've had this case in Australia where News Corp, but not just News Corp, the rest of the Australian media said, we don't want, we won't have this any longer. And Facebook then curiously banned, as far as I can understand what I read in the newspapers, banned or said, we're going to leave Australia. At which point everybody was so outraged by it. And Facebook have sort of backed down. Now, that's only the beginning. It's a bit like what all of us who were in Fleet Street, I'm talking about when I was at the Telegraph then, we went through these horrors which were led by News and Murdoch, but we all came up, thank God, underneath his shadow. And the result of that was that we all made newspapers more viable. But the dike was broken with the print unions then. Now, the question is, I don't know the answer. It's possible that what's just happened in Australia will mean that Google and Facebook and Microsoft and Amazon, to the extent that it's getting into media, will no longer be able just to effectively pirate the expensive copy articles that have been created by the newspapers. I think that would be very healthy. I have no idea where it's going to go. I'm very, very pleased to see that the Australian government actually stood behind the media there. And I've said about 100% of my knowledge now. If I were questioned on it, I wouldn't be able to answer much more, but I just feel it's a very positive little thing that has happened.
So the Australia issue is interesting. The Australian government was proposing a law which essentially would mandate that
That's right, yeah.
Google's and Facebook's had to pay for content, any kind of content. And the problem with that was that, is the newsletter published by the, Sydney Suburbs Football Association content. And so it was a sort of badly written and somewhat unworkable law. And it ended up, frankly, the Murdoch empire did a perfectly nice deal and got a large check from Google from it, and indeed now from Facebook. I'm less worried about them, I mean, I think the big digital giants are going into content creation and are paying for content big time. And I think if you look across content creation, if you look across sort of film and podcasting and all manner of things, people are paying enormous amounts of money for good content. It's an absolute bonanza of a time to be a filmmaker. It's a bonanza of a time to be a person who's got a podcast following. You can get paid an absolute fortune because every platform wants content that people are listening to. I also think that there are really interesting business models being developed by upstart media organizations, whether it's narrow niche, really good reporting, the Information being which is a sort of tech newsletter, brilliantly done. The Athletic's an absolute fantastic success story at building a new kind of journalistic model. So I'm sort of more optimistic, I think, than it sounds like you are about quality journalism finding new business models in this new environment. And I think that there are definitely, as I said before, there are some areas which may end up being underserved, and local news, which I think is really important for holding local politicians to account. There are all kinds of societal needs that come from that. I'm not quite sure what the business model is that sustains local news. And in the UK, I think one reason for, when we can get onto the BBC in a minute, but one really important role of the BBC is not just a sort of useful global tool of soft power for the UK, but there is an important societal role played by the BBC that we would be worse off as a country if we didn't have it. And so that requires public money. It does require public money, but broadly, I think that there are sustainable business models for a lot more journalism than it sounds as though you think. And I'm not so worried that we have to get some sort of, we have to impose penalties on Google and Facebook to get there. They will be paying for it. They already are. Facebook is paying large numbers of news creators now for their content.
Yes, whether it has an editing structure, as you're familiar with at The Economist, and which all the UK papers and the top, and the New York Times and the Washington Post, for example, and the Wall Street Journal very much have it in America, which does actually sift out a lot of poor stuff or badly analyzed stuff. At the moment, the difficulty I would posit, the difficulty with the kind of news that they are fostering is that it is, to an extent, the content itself is quite sensationalist, because that is what gets more clicks and therefore raises the advertising rates that they're able to charge. And of course, leads to some advertising which the regulators are finding very hard, as we've seen in the UK in the last week or so, finding quite hard to limit or to monitor. So
but that's always been the case, right? I mean, you've always had the tabloid press.
It's a little, yes, I'm just saying, all I think is that at the moment it's a little bit Wild West, which is fun and healthy. But the question I was raising at the beginning is, where does it actually lead to? For example, it could lead to the extinction. I completely agree with you about the BBC, but it could easily lead to the extinction of the BBC. Because streaming, for example, is already causing an enormous crisis at the BBC, I would think, which will materialize even more strongly.
But
the business
that's
models
where I think
are very interesting.
for public service. I do think that, I mean, it'd be interesting what other thing, and there's a question related to this about the role of public service broadcasting. Does it have a future? Should the license fee pay for it, or should the BBC find a new model? And I think my take on this, and this may be different, certainly to Bill's, I think, if I may be maligning Bill Emmett here, but I think he had a different view. I think there is a public service role for the BBC that should be taxpayer funded. I'm not sure it should necessarily be the license fee. It might need to come out of general taxation. But I think if I look at the US, I think the US would be better off if it had stronger public broadcasting. And I think there is a sort of unifying social role, even if it's not watched by, absolutely everybody. And it may be a narrower, more news focused, and perhaps not quite as broad as the BBC now is. But I think we would be worse off without something like the BBC. And I think you're right, Andrew. It won't, you couldn't create the BBC on a purely commercial basis, and you certainly won't be able to in 10 years.
The trouble with the proliferation of media and the sheer quantity and now gigantism involved in it is that the BBC will, however much it's, well, not however much, but say its budget was doubled to 10 million as opposed to 5 million, it's still going to be a pimple on the bottom of media society. It's simply, you know, it will be a hobby for a lot of people. And the real concern I have is the overwhelming nature, rather like, going back to Teddy Roosevelt, rather like the oil companies and the banks were frankly overwhelming American free enterprise society. That is what I think we're possibly corporately facing. I don't know what, if Bill was there, what he would think about that. But I think these are real problems which are not going to go away. We have something which is immensely virtuous, immensely good in its impact on society, our ability to communicate. As you said, this Zoom is a little example of it. Look how we're able to deal with and somehow mitigate the horrors of the pandemic by actually communicating with, I hope, several dozen people all together now on the screens. It's an amazing thing, absolutely amazing. I couldn't have dreamt of it when I joined The Economist in 1486. You know, it's an extraordinary change for the better, for the better. Going to the business model, you have rightly gone for the subscription model, which has always been the model of The Economist, particularly in its post-advertising boom days. And we had a very interesting, I don't know whether this would interest somebody, but there was an enormous, almost ideological battle between The Guardian and The Times, where The Guardian believed that if it could put it out free, it would compensate in terms, it would get the advertising revenue. And of course, its numbers shot up, particularly in the United States. But what it hadn't realized, this is my contention, what it hadn't realized was that the rate for digital advertising is pennies rather than pounds. So of course it ran into considerable difficulty financially, which it will get through because it's a very fine publication. The Times and the Telegraph sort of went talking about the Fleet Street newspapers, ex-Fleet Street newspapers. They went for a paywall, which there was a lot of doubt about, but to my considerable surprise has actually worked. I mean, the Times is actually profitable, probably for the first time since Mr. Murdoch owned it. Mr. Murdoch has put billions, literally a billion, no, not billions, a billion plus into keeping the Times going all the time since he's owned it. Now it actually washes its face, amazingly, at a time when you would have thought it was going to be extinguished by what we're talking about. So there are so many things happening. It goes back to what you were saying earlier. There are so many extraordinary changes which don't just affect us, they affect everything, health. We've just seen all this in the vaccine and so on. I mean, most amazing changes are taking place everywhere and in every single industry. And as you rightly say, in retailing as well.
There's a really interesting, related to that, Andrew, there's an interesting question here about, are we in danger of creating a two-tier media consumption, those who can afford subscriptions and those who can't? I think my answer to that would be yes, that is exactly what's going to happen. And that there is going to be, you know, high, relatively expensive subscriptions for really quality journalism. I suspect there will be, I mean, extrapolating from our own case, there's actually an enormous amount of access you can get to Economist journalism without paying a penny. If you follow us on social media, you can get quite a lot without paying anything. So I suspect
there's no more advertising, more advertising.
Yeah.
No, I'm sorry, I'm teasing you. Sorry, you're promoting your newspaper.
Of course I am. I would be remiss if I wasn't. But I will now pay you back for that by asking you a tough question here, which is entirely appropriate for you. Thoughts on Andrew Neil's GB News and the effect it will have on UK society? Good thing or bad thing?
Well, I'm going to say something which disagrees with something that was written in The Economist recently, or disagrees with.
You've got to answer that question. You can't ignore that question.
No, I'm getting to it now. It's on Andrew Neil. It's the inference to be drawn of an offhand remark in The Economist about Andrew Neil. You were talking about the right-wingery that is that is taking place in the UK politically, and then appended onto it the somehow with a sense which is behind this question as well, that Andrew Neil is somehow an extremist. He is not. He is he's economist educated. He was at the Economist for many years. He was absolutely brilliant on the trade unions, the best trade union correspondent, I think Bill would agree, certainly in the earlier years, when trade unions were a massive factor in British society, massive, massive factor, and much more than they are today. Then political, and he then went to America, where I sort of forced him to go, crying the whole way, but he loved it when he got there. Met Mr. Murdoch, and the rest is history. He became editor of the Sunday Times at a very young age. Andrew, I think if you watch him or listen to him, he's one of the brightest invigilators, and he's not like Paxman. In other words, he doesn't have a bitter twist. He just is very direct from a conservative point of view. And I don't think that is wicked in any way. He's deeply free market. I do not see in any way Andrew as being somehow a representative of sort of populist Brexitism or whatever in that way. I think he's a very serious broadcaster. He modeled himself, funnily enough, on my predecessor as editor of our newspaper, your newspaper, Alistair Burnett. Alistair Burnett was Andrew's absolute model. He followed him, and I think Bill will remember this, with devotion and admiration, and right, Alistair was an extraordinary broadcaster. Andrew has more of an attack about him than Alistair ever did, because he's into questioning. But when he questions, I think it's usually a very serious debate. So from a conservative point of view,
so I think it's a reasonable summary to suggest that
he's certainly no extremist.
But the conclusion of that, I think, to answer Karen Schofield's question, is that you think that GB News will have a good impact on UK society.
Well, that goes interestingly to the whole, for example, of Fox News and what happened there in the US. Fox News, in my view, became something which was far more extremely on the right than I think was originally intended. That could happen to any channel, but we are in a multi-channel world. And I think it's actually very healthy to have good media in each medium, television, radio, and newspapers, obviously, in the form that you've just described them quite rightly. It's the more proliferation you can have, provided it is not extreme and unsavory. And I certainly don't think, now GB News as a whole, I know nothing about, so I can't actually answer it. I'm just saying that Andrew, I regard very, very highly as an individual and as a broadcaster. So my response is
I agree with that. I mean, my answer to the question,
limited to that.
Yeah, my answer to the question would be that actually I don't think it's a bad thing. I agree with that, with this Andrew here, that having breadths of opinion is no bad thing. And I think that, but I think it raises the importance of retaining the public broadcaster role that we have in the BBC. I think the lesson of the US, in my view, is not that it was a bad idea to have the proliferation of cable news channels. The lesson is that there's no sort of public service broadcaster there, and I think there is a role for that.
Well, there is PBS, of course.
Yeah, but it's
if one's in one's car, that's what I listen to if I'm motoring.
So I'm with you on that. I think that, although I think it's a good thing that this is happening. I do think that we are mirroring cultural divisions that I slightly feel a sense of deja vu of what happened in the US beginning to happen here, and that worries me. I mean,
Yeah,
it's a reflection of where society is, but the kind of culture wars, the, you know, sort of picking cultural tropes on both sides.
Yes, I take
into an almost stereotypical debate we're seeing in this country in a way that we didn't used to, and that becomes self-fulfilling.
I would only, yes, I quite agree. And of course, the guys, you know, presumably on Fox News would say, well, look at CNN, which after all has had its times when it, in Turner's days, when it was very much on the other side. The only thing I would say to reassure you is that it's quite difficult, I would think, to set up a minority station on an extreme side of any political debate in this country, simply because we are 70 million people not getting on to 300. What Murdoch, and I remember the debates when I was involved there, what Murdoch spotted, I should say that I voted against the idea of setting up Fox News, not because I thought it was going to be extreme, but because I thought it was going to fail. And I couldn't have been proved more wrong. And I thought it was going to fail because you had CBS, NBC, ABC, and the Fox television station, which was very good and around most places. And then the Washington Post was getting into regional television and so on. There was massive proliferation. I thought there just wasn't room. What Murdoch noticed was that in a huge population with a lot of wealth, as America is, even a tiny fraction is enough to make money on. And Fox News started making money surprisingly quickly on a very small amount of people watching it. It then became a bit of a phenomenon. And so people watched it even almost to go on hating it. I mean, I know several friends in San Francisco, for example, who watch it, they loathe it, but they watch it just in order to annoy themselves and to so on. So it's now become a phenomenon of its own. But when he started it in the teeth of some opposition inside the company, because he reckoned that even a small fraction of the US viewing public was enough to succeed, and it would be a countervailing voice to the liberal consensus as he saw it. Of course, it succeeded in commercial terms beyond his dreams, I think.
But that might well be the case here.
The fractions here are much smaller, aren't they, Zanny? I mean,
I mean, it's a fourth or whatever. I mean, it's a fifth. It's not orders of magnitude smaller. So there were two really good questions here, actually, that have just come up. One is, isn't this proliferation we're talking about going to be proliferation only on the right, i.e. broadcasters, not from other perspectives?
Why is that? Because the money's there, you mean?
Well, I'm sort of interested because that's not the case in the US. I mean, if we think America is a useful lesson of what could happen here, you've actually seen, polarization in both directions. The more extreme has been to the right, but the striking thing is that MSNBC, which is the liberal equivalent of Fox, not as extreme, but nonetheless pretty darn liberal, has been doing very well. And I think that it actually raises quite an interesting question for those of us who like to think that we can kind of be above the fray and be quality journalism, which is that even in a world where you are subscriber driven, and what you're trying to do, your business model is based on being on your subscribers and your number of subscribers. The lesson from the United States, and the lesson of the New York Times in particular, is that does not prevent you from going down a kind of fairly ideological agenda. In fact, it reinforces that. So the subscriber-driven model pushes, I think, at least in the American context, is pushing newspapers to be on one side or other side of in a polarized country, because that's people, the kind of core subscribers who are the mainstay of their commercial model now are lapping up that kind of content.
Fascinating.
So it doesn't necessarily, insure you against a very polarized media having a subscriber base.
No, and I do completely agree with you that the polarization in the US has been absolutely magnified and accelerated by the media, which Fox News is certainly part of. The media battles, if I can put it that way. I can't argue with that. I just think we're a more phlegmatic society. I just feel it won't happen here. And we're smaller, and it's harder to make a smaller place, make it profitable. We do, we have the BBC, which I think is using the word liberal in the American sense, that you were using it with a small L, so to speak, not in the traditional English sense. We have quite a powerful liberal sense here, which, where the Guardian obviously is a very, very good example of it. The Financial Times, oddly, when you think what its main readership is, the Mirror among the tabloids. It's relatively well balanced here, I feel. Whereas in America, oddly, at the time I was there, the liberal consensus was overpowering. It really was. I mean, all the networks, all three of the networks were in that direction, not in any way, in a poor way. It just was the overarching feel that you got. And of course, the newspapers very much so, other than in Chicago maybe, and probably in Texas, although I can't ever remember reading a newspaper in Texas, but I should think that was probably fairly on the right. But certainly in San Francisco, Los Angeles, it was, and that's, I think, one of the things that Murdoch himself felt some satisfaction in taking on, if I can put it that way, because he was a Thatcherite.
There's one more question here, which I think is one for you too, which is, what is the sense in the digital world of due impartiality being required by statute of licensed broadcasters, but not other news providers?
Of licensed broadcasters?
Yeah.
Oh,
yeah, because that's the truth here. Broadcasters have to have due impartiality.
Yes. No, I think that's a good thing, if I can put it that way. If you remember when, again, going back to Fox and all that, when Sky News was set up, it made an absolute sort of fetish almost of being impartial, and has been and is to this day. I don't see it so often now. And maybe others on the call may disagree with that, but I'm pretty sure that wasn't because it was required. So I don't actually really know the answer. I'm just terribly reluctant to see almost any statute other than defamation and libel get involved in media. But I'm very happy to be disagreed with about that. I may be showing my age.
No, I'm with you on that, actually. And maybe this is the sort of provocative place to since we're getting to the end of the hour, I am as worried about constraints on free speech in the current media debate than I am about the opposite. I think there's an awful lot. I really do worry about cancel culture, self-censorship, what is deemed no longer to be, suitable to discuss. I think there's an intolerance. There's a sort of growing illiberalism, and there's the last year, I think, has shown that we're, as a society, perfectly happy to be told what to do, and to a degree that I would have never predicted. Now, we're in an extraordinary pandemic, of course, but there is a sort of profound illiberal trait in the British that I hadn't really sort of realized was quite.
I so agree with you, and I do think, actually, as we are coming to the end of the hour, that would be a fabulously interesting thing for the school to, for this series, if you could get two people to come in and debate and talk about the whole cancel culture, which I regard as one of the most iniquitous things that is happening to our societies at the moment. It's not just here in America, it's appalling what's been happening at Yale and some of the other universities where people are just being cancelled. And here, but we can't get into it
although
now.
I think we should, it's two generations below you, Andrew, and a generation below me, but it's the next generation's kind of the views on what is appropriate speech and what is not appropriate speech are changing, are generationally changing. And I think there's a really interesting development in what is, you know, how much speech should be allowed. And my sense is that they are changing in quite an illiberal direction. And that, you know, societies evolve, generations are different. But I'm struck that there's a bigger shift there than I think, you know, we've missed.
I completely agree with you. I see it all the time with my younger generations and people I meet. The question is where is the dividing line? Because I obviously come from a generation when it was perfectly normal to say offensive things. You said offensive things because you knew you would be picked up on them, and you would then discuss it and argue it. And I have to say, I'm obviously showing my generation, I'm concerned where some things cannot be said without effectively being crimes, because it does lead to a cancelling culture. Now, that is a subject for an enormous debate, obviously. When you've got inequalities of the kind that we, in our Western civilizations and more widely, as well as anywhere, when you see people being persecuted and ill-treated and slavery and all those things, it's absolutely appropriate to me that you should not be able to say offensive things about people who are in minorities or come from them. But the danger of that is that it leads to a thing where you cannot say anything offensive about anybody. And that is the worry to me. But it's a huge subject. I'm glad you've raised it, but it's for discussion. And you're completely right about the generational divide, obviously. But that's good. I mean, thank God that new generations don't agree.
Yeah, I would have put it slightly differently, I think, but I do. I think we are just sort of broadly in a kind of illiberal moment. If you look across the world, the rise of, you know, liberal democracies are in retreat, and authoritarian regimes are on the march. And so broadly, just as a matter of fact, the room for free speech globally is shrinking. And I think there's a separate question about sort of self-imposed limits and what. And I think I have more sort of. I guess I'm more inclined to think that there is the way we speak about things has changed, and rightly so. And you know,
I agree.
Respect for other people and respect for different viewpoints has changed fundamentally, and rightly so. So I'm not sure I would say one should go out to be offensive. I don't think that's true, but I think that one should be able to have conversations about all manner of things. So that I'm not sure are that conversations are as open and the subjects for debate are as broad as they might be. I guess that's where I'd come out. But I think it's a really, really important subject. I think as important as the kind of where organized media is going and what the future of journalism is what is the future of public discourse. And one of the consequences of the digital revolution is it's all been much more democratized, as you said at the beginning. And so what is the nature of the debate that we as a society and the generations below us as a society want to have, and what are the parameters that shape that debate? I think it's a really, really important question.
Yes, I quite agree. I mean, the word you just used, discourse, I meant to actually, when I was telling myself what to say earlier today, actually to use. I think it's absolutely right. What is the nature of discourse and what role does the media play in it? I think it is totally healthy that the media is proliferating and growing exponentially. It brings with it things that actually are damaging discourse.
Well, that seems a very big point at which to end on, but I'm not sure we've solved anything, Andrew, but I've had a lovely time discussing it.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Zanny and Andrew, and great food for thought there for a future event. Very exciting. But thank you both for sharing your knowledge, insight and visions for the future of media with us all this evening. It's been absolutely captivating. And thank you to our wonderful audience for your great questions and continued support of our online talks. And although this brings us to the end of our online series this side of the Easter break, please keep an eye on the forthcoming events page. I think the link will be in the chat, where we are posting an eclectic mix of new and inspiring events over the next week or so. Another great place to hear about our upcoming events is via our foundation Instagram. And if you would like to follow us on that platform too, please do. I think, again, the details can be found in the chat. Sadly, that brings us to the end of this evening's talk. As always, thank you for joining us tonight. And thank you again, Zanny and Andrew, for an incredibly inspiring hour. I'd like to wish you all a very happy Easter, and we look forward to seeing you all back here at the start of the summer term. Thank you.